Good. Hey, thank you for rescheduling, by the way. I had to go out of town for the last one. I am glad to see you. I mean, for more than one reason. It's great to talk to you, but it's good to see you still around. So that's wonderful. How are things? Are you still in the UK or where are you located?
Yeah, I'm in the UK at the moment. I'm in Oxford. It was interesting to see you talking to Isabella yesterday because she's a good friend of mine,
Oh,
and
okay. I didn't
we
realize that. Yeah.
worked together in the past. So
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's it's been a good week then. We've got a couple folks here there. So for those who don't know, can you just give us a brief background? I mean, I know your story, at least maybe not the last 2 years since I haven't talked to you in about 2 years, but tell us a little briefly about your story. You've got a kind of a, I think, a very incredible story that's encouraging and I think is maybe providing a lot of insight for things. But go ahead and remind us of a little bit about yourself.
well, I'll try and give the short version. So 8 years ago now, I was studying for just over 8 years. I was studying for a master's in nutritional therapy, and I was suffering from quite horrendous migraines, trying to work out what the problem was, looking at my diet and lifestyle and everything. And after a while, it got so bad that I suffered a brain hemorrhage on a train. And that led to me being diagnosed with a highly malignant vascular brain tumor and grand mal seizures. So I had epilepsy as a result of that, which was in itself could have been quite fatal because every time I had a seizure, I was suffering quite extensive damage to my brain and to my body, because when you have those kinds of seizures, you lose complete control of all your faculties and all of your bodily functions. So after my brain cancer diagnosis, where I was told I would have to have chemotherapy and radiotherapy or I would face a very grim prognosis, I decided to go on a very strict ketogenic diet to try and manage the epilepsy initially. And over time, I abandoned the standard of care, the chemotherapy and radiotherapy, when I realized that my tumor was not chemosensitive or radiosensitive. And I just went full on with different metabolic approaches to manage my complex issues, not least the cancer. I had a host of other issues related to the symptoms that I was experiencing, which were as dangerous, I would say, as the cancer. So to cut a long story short, I had monitoring for this over the years, ever since I decided to abandon my treatment. The first scan afterwards was showing that I had some signaling activity still there. I was having a type of scan called it's MR spectroscopy. So it's looking at the bioenergetic demands of the tumor area. And you're actually able to see what kind of tumor you're looking at non-invasively through these methods. And fortunately for me, it was also a very efficacious way of monitoring any kind of metabolic approach to managing brain cancer. And over time, as I was getting more and more strict into these methods, that high signaling activity that was showing on the scans eventually disappeared into nothing. And the damage that I'd sustained to my brain and the scar tissue that was present was healing as well. And with that, I had over time complete control over my seizures, thanks to the methods I applied to manage that.
Yeah, and so you never had surgery or anything. This was non-radiosensitive, non-chemosensitive. Did you have a surgical approach? I know sometimes
I
they can
did
do.
have surgery,
Okay.
But they weren't able to remove all of it because it was so vascular, and the area that they had, the part that they had to leave in was touching the motor strip area of my brain. So if they tried to operate on that, I would have been paralyzed.
Sure. And so basically a debulking procedure was done. What was it? Was it astrocytoma? Forgive me if I can't remember the exact diagnosis you had.
Yeah, it was grade 3 astrocytoma, so that's termed an anaplastic astrocytoma. But interesting to me is that there was a recent. I always had a theory about how it came about, due to the fact that initially we had assumed that from looking at it, that it may have been a cavernous hemangioma, which is not a brain tumor at all. But upon further investigations, it was deemed to be a highly aggressive anaplastic astrocytoma. And more recent evidence is showing that my theory about that it may have not initially been a brain tumor but underwent malignant transformation is that there's recently a paper showing that that brain injury can result in formation of these kinds of brain tumors. And so a cavernous hemangioma is a cluster of abnormal blood vessels in the brain, and that's kind of like, you could say it's like a brain injury in a way. It's not, it's where you have this area of inflammation and all these pro-inflammatory cytokines and all this, horrible stuff in there.
That's not inconsistent. I mean, there are other tumors that act similarly. We see with chronic skin irritation wounds, sometimes that will transform into a cancerous type situation. So that's not without precedent for sure. When you talk about, you said it was NM spectroscopy or MR spectroscopy. What were you actually measuring? I mean, what is it measuring more specifically? Is it measuring uptake of certain nutrients? Is it measuring uptake of, well, tell me what did you think? What does it measure to your knowledge?
Well, I actually gave a presentation on this a few years ago, because that in itself is pretty interesting. But it's looking at these peaks and troughs of different substrates, I guess you could say. It's looking at choline and a few other things that I haven't studied it in a while, but it's just looking at how the tumor is taking up these different fuels, and it's associated with these different peaks and troughs that you see that indicate different represent different things. But
so clearly, I mean, the cancer cells are utilizing fuels in a different way than the normal surrounding brain tissue, and so you're able to watch those signals, get smaller and smaller and eventually fade to nothing.
And you're able to attempt to determine what fuels it's taking up most. So with some of those metabolites, it suggests that, at least in my case, it suggested that it was a highly glycolytic tumor. So I would benefit very well from restricting, theoretically, I'd benefit very well from restricting carbohydrates or insulin and associated growth factors.
I know you're familiar with Thomas Seyfried. I mean, I've interviewed him, a few years ago, and I think he even referenced you as one of the people that he was talking about with regards to the metabolic properties of cancer, and that being a metabolic disease rather than a somatic cell mutation disease. So I know you've gone on to study. I think you're pursuing a PhD. I don't know if you're still doing that or what was going on with that, but as far as a tumor goes, I mean, how do you still get periodic imaging? I mean, what's the latest sort of thing to sort of see how we're doing with this progress? I mean, obviously you're here and you look like you're functioning fine, and I assume you've been relatively seizure free. I remember reading some of your stuff about, this led to seizures, this didn't, and all the things you. So let's talk about how you've tracked things over the years, and then what things you've done to, I know because ketogenic diet plays a role in this, but there's other things that you do as well. So let's talk about that.
Well, interestingly, I had COVID recently, and that kind of messed things up a bit because it made me have more focal seizures, but I hadn't had any seizures for a long time. But I only had a mild case of COVID, so that was interesting in itself. But yeah, what was the question? Just how I managed my.
Yeah, I just wanted to see what the progress and how you're tracking and assessing the tumor remission? Do you get annual, MRIs, or how do we manage that? And how do you, like you said, you have the COVID thing, and then we can dump into that, but let's talk about your tumor stuff.
Well, I have scans every 16 months now, and that's by choice. I can have it whenever I like now, because initially it was seen as an emergency situation where I was having scans every 3 to 4 months. And the other thing I noticed was that the contrast agent was problematic for me. I learned that very early on. And I learned that this contrast agent can actually potentially make things worse for the cancer. So I decided to stop having that. So I haven't had contrast for a few years. And this might seem like an irrelevant point, but it's actually quite, I feel like it's quite relevant and quite important to note, because the gadolinium, which is what's used in head and neck cancers, can actually contribute to insulin resistance and all these other things. So there's a lot to this apart from just diet. There are other contributory factors, and that's definitely one of them. So yeah, I only have scans at least once every 16 months now.
And the most recent one, I assume, was good.
It's boring. Yeah, it didn't show anything.
Well, that's nice. Boring is good. Yeah, I mean, the gadolinium, I would assume humans were not designed to be processing gadolinium. We used to use that, for neurologic ischemia, particularly in the in the spine. So that it's part of my orthopedic stuff. We would sometimes use, MRIs with GAD. But yeah, you're right. There is potential problems with those contrast agents. And then some of them are even, there's other ones they use for like that are nephrotoxic, different type of imaging contrast agent. But so talk about, okay, so diet. I know you've talked about ketogenic diets. I think you've played with carnivorous diet. I know you've talked about entomophagy, which is bug eating and stuff like that.
Got my insect farm right there. You probably can't see it, but yeah.
Well, let's talk a little about those things. So what are you doing besides, well, what's your diet? What diet approaches have you tried? What's worked? What hasn't? What are the other things that you're doing that may also be additive to, helping with this situation?
Well, when I was trying to manage my epilepsy, I found that I failed miserably on a standard ketogenic diet for epilepsy. Even a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet wasn't helping me. In fact, it made my seizures worse. And I was thinking, well, I don't want to give up on this. So I looked up different foods and why I was getting these seizures triggered from certain foods that I'd noted in my diaries, because I kept a very detailed diary of everything that I ate and all my macronutrients and everything. And I found a correlation with all these plant foods that were supposed to be like staples of a ketogenic diet. And eventually that led me to excluding all those foods and seeing how I fared. And I noticed a dramatic, almost instantaneous benefit where I just had complete seizure control, and I thought that was quite cool. And it did take some time to transition to the point where I was able to come off all of my medication, which I was told would be impossible because I was still having seizures at that time. But I managed to do it thanks to just having this very restricted diet of what we now see as like a carnivore diet. It wasn't a thing at the time, but it became more popular. It became a thing. Other people were doing it, but I didn't know anyone who was doing it for any reason, let alone epilepsy. But I did know about what's called an oligoantigenic ketogenic diet, which is used traditionally due to the fact that with epilepsy in children who have these seizure disorders from birth usually, or they're developed very early on, they can have these kind of food sensitivities. So it's like a type of allergy. Their seizures are brought on by certain ingredients, like say it could be, it's usually gluten or it can be dairy. So I just cut out loads of things, but I noticed it was mainly plant foods, and then I cut out dairy, and I found benefits from that as well. And then just I thought, well, what can I include on this diet, and how can I make it nutrient dense? So I decided to add things like, first I decided to add organ meats, especially looking into ancestral diets. And it made perfect sense to me to add brain, because I was having problems with my brain. I thought that makes logical sense. And then I did some tests with sweetbreads, and I found that was the most ketogenic food for me. My ketones shot up. And then I was able to establish that I had this therapeutic zone of blood ketones and blood glucose that gave me complete control of my epilepsy. And not only control, but I had certain periods of time where I felt kind of like I was high, like I just wanted to just jump around and, to just not necessarily just be very active, but to take in information and to learn and to use my brain. So yeah, it's kind of like feeling superhuman at times.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And so, do you strive to? Is there some sort of macronutrient ratio you strive to hit even today? Is a 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1? Where are you at today, and what keeps you in a state of ketosis? And what were those parameters you're looking at? I know people like to use something called the glucose ketone index. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So, what are the numbers you're looking at, and what are you eating at right now?
Well, initially I was on a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet. I'm now on a 3-to-1. So I'm able to be more relaxed about it now. It's still strictly ketogenic, but it's a bit different. I can actually even tolerate some of the foods that I couldn't tolerate before, which is very interesting. So even if I had a small amount of those foods, it would instantly trigger a seizure for me. And now that's not the case. And that's correlated with the healing of the brain that we see on the scans. So that in itself is quite interesting. But now I'd say it's still a mainly carnivorous diet. I still eat the organ meats. I was going to have lamb heart today because it's Valentine's Day. And I like lamb heart because it's very fatty. It's fattier than, say, beef heart. So yeah, I usually have that. And I have my fatty insects. So I have my waxworms. They have ketogenic ratios. And I feed them lots of honey, so they get pretty fat. They eat what I can't eat and convert it into what I can. And I give them supplemental things as well. So I have this vitamin D that I drop into their feed, and I just like to manipulate their feed to give it the macronutrient and micronutrient profiles that I'm looking for, and I seem to get benefits from that.
Yeah, a couple questions from folks. Somebody's asking, did you find any particular plant foods particularly problematic for you? Was there a spectrum where grains are really bad, or what? How did you sort of find different plants affecting you?
Well, interestingly, I found that it was correlated with foods high in salicylates. So I definitely had salicylate sensitivity. So this was actually coconut oil, which people often at that time, at least on ketogenic diets, thought it was like this magical thing. So yeah, I still can't have coconut oil in even moderate amounts. So coconut oil, avocado, broccoli, probably missing a few things out, but those were the main triggers for me.
All right, the waxworms. People want to know: do you cook them? What do they taste like? How much do you eat? I mean, you got to eat. I can't imagine you got to eat a lot of them to get any significant amount of food from them. I imagine. I don't know. And how often do you do that? Is that something has it been beneficial to you? I mean, over and above and beyond just eating regular meat, or what's the deal on the bugs?
Well, the main reason that I got into entomophagy is because at that time when I was doing this, I was focusing on food quality. And although I had a local farm near me, I wanted to make sure that I knew where my food was coming from and what he was eating, and that's very important to me. So they taste kind of like prawns, but fattier, because prawns aren't very fatty. And they with how many I have in the tank there, it's and how quickly their life cycles go, you can actually have quite a lot of food in a small space. And I am thinking of having more of the tanks, because that's a glass tank. They can eat plastic, so I don't have any plastic near them, because what they do is they eat plastic and then it comes out as alcohol, so they poop alcohol.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do they have any chitin? I mean, I know because there's a concern about, and I don't, I mean, there's obviously some people where they're pushing for there to be cricket farms. So we're going to eating crickets. They're going to grind it, and they already do it. They grind it up in flour and put it in protein bars. But one of the concerns out there is, humans have not been exposed to copious amounts of chitin, probably small amounts, but do these worms express chitin? Is that something? Because I don't think they have an exoskeleton, or maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe when they're adults, they become. I don't know what they turn. I don't know much about wax worms. Maybe you can educate me on that.
Yeah, the thing with that is, you're right. Lots of people have lost this through evolution, depending on which area of the world you live in. So some people still have this enzyme because the population has still been consuming insects, and this played a large role in our evolution, how we evolved. So at different life stages, they will have more. They will have more of this chitin, but if you eat them at the larval stage, then it's not an issue. Or that there are other insects that don't have this same kind of exoskeleton. But that's one of the reasons why I don't seem to have a problem with it, but it's one of the reasons I have the beetles more, because they're not as fibrous as, say, crickets and locusts. Incidentally, locusts have very high levels of magnesium, so quite a good source of magnesium.
Somebody was asking me about a good source of magnesium for supplementation. I did not think to mention locusts, so thank you for that. For future reference, I'll be able to tell them to go munch on some locusts. So tell me, did you go back to school, or what's going on with you currently? What's your current deal?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was due to do my PhD with the help of Isabella, who you were speaking to. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it? But then thanks to COVID, that kind of stalled because I wasn't able to travel to London and back. So that's hopefully in the pipeline for the future. At the moment, I've just been working part-time at the hospital near me, mainly with brain cancer patients. But I'm moving more into epilepsy because that's a passion of mine, trying to interpret it would be operating the EEGs, which is the electrodes that go on the head, and then interpreting what that means, and then helping patients to work out how to solve these challenging problems with the help of the neurologist.
Yeah, so I mean, the electroencephalography is pretty interesting stuff. Let me ask you, so we've talked a little bit about diet. What other things impacted your cancer, your epilepsy outside of diet?
Well, I have Boswellic acids. And that's been a huge benefit to whenever you have swelling in the brain, they like to prescribe dexamethasone, which is a very effective treatment to dampen that swelling, but it has a host of negative consequences, one of which is that it raises your blood sugar to the level of type 2 diabetic, even if you don't have diabetes. And that's quite anti-ketogenic. So I was very quick to get away from that. And the Boswellic acids was acting as a very effective replacement for that. You can see in the literature, they actually have side-to-side comparisons of dexamethasone and the Boswellic acids in the form of Boswellia serrata, most notably, but I take high-dose Boswellia serrata, but also in combination with the other Boswellic acids in the form of an oil that I have under my tongue. And that's able to get to my brain very quickly. I've actually been able to, at times, reverse an experience of having an aura, which is when it's like a warning sign that you're about to have a seizure. So I've applied this sublingually and been able to reverse some almost certain serious seizure activity with the aid of that.
So do you sleep, exercise, circadian biology stuff? Does any of that stuff have a role?
Absolutely massive, yeah. Well, I have the blue light blockers that I put on as soon as the sun goes down. And when the sun comes up in the morning, that's when I'm up and I go for a 2-hour walk. The 2-hour walk, I find, actually puts me in that therapeutic ketosis that allows me to feel normal. If I don't go for that walk, then it's a lot more difficult, because I think you do get that effect after waking when your cortisol wakes you up, where your blood sugar naturally goes up a little bit, and that can be problematic for me if I don't go for this walk, which effectively lowers my blood sugar. And I also do breathing exercises for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and obviously that dawn effect that some diabetics see. We have this ready for the day, but if we get up ready for the day and all we do is sit around, it's probably not how we're designed. I would say. I imagine most, early humans, sunlight got up, they got up and got moving. And I do something similar. I've got dogs, so I take them for anywhere between a half hour to an hour walk first thing in the morning, and that's right after the sun comes up. And so I think there's a lot to that. Does blood glucose? So I mean, I don't know how often you check that, but you said it rises. Is there a trigger point where if your blood glucose gets above a certain level, you'll start noticing auras or seizure activity or focal seizures, anything like that? And what is that number for you, if you know?
Yeah, so I go by millimolars, so I'm not sure if it's easy for you to convert. But my blood glucose tends to be naturally very low. So it's usually when it gets past 3.2 where it starts to get more of this low-level seizure activity. And then when it creeps up, often after a meal, it'll be much higher. But yeah, if it gets, usually after a meal, if it goes past 5, then it's problematic for me. But then it comes down and it's fine. So every time I'm eating, even if it's a ketogenic meal or a carnivorous ketogenic meal, then I can have problems, because it's just metabolizing any food seems to give me at least low-level seizure activity, because I have a type of epilepsy called reflex epilepsy. So it's just about lessening the signal. It's not about trying to completely stop it, because it's kind of like you have exposed wiring. If you keep poking at that wiring, it's going to do something. But it's better to poke at it, say, with something non-conductive, like, I don't know, rubber, than if you're just pouring it with water, I guess. I don't know. That's just my analogy that I just came up with, but I think it's relevant. But
yeah, I was just doing a quick conversion on your numbers, and it looks like 3.2 is about 57 milligrams per deciliter for us in the US, and then 5 is like 90. So those are pretty low numbers.
Yeah, the lowest my blood sugar has gone is 2.0.
2.0, so that'd be 36. So,
I lost a lot of weight to that point. So
yeah, sure. So that's that's obviously very low. I mean, there's people that would argue that you should be symptomatic and hypoglycemic at that, and I've seen that in myself, and I've seen among a lot of people in this community, particularly people that eat a really high fat approach, that they typically run numbers that are very low and they're fine. And I think, Cahill demonstrated that in the 70s or 60s when he did these prolonged fasting experiments where he had people, in your numbers, I think even as low as 1.5, and they were fine, as long as they were producing ketones.
The only time it's different is if I'm doing more glycolytic exercise. And then I need the help of exogenous ketones to stop having seizures.
Interesting. Glycolytic exercise can raise your blood glucose. And I don't know if you see that because it's, the endogenous glucose production via the liver cranks up something like 1,500%. So you get 15 times the output of your sort of basal amount. So yeah, you see it. And I see that as something similar. When I get done killing it in the gym, my blood glucose is up a little bit, and that's how we're designed to work. But
I have to have long recovery periods, and I have to do all out power. So I usually have a pull-up bar there, and I just do a few pull-ups every time I walk past it.
Tell me about, so obviously you've been involved with doctors, probably maybe primary care, oncologists, neurologists, I would imagine, throughout this. Have any of them sort of marveled at your situation, wondered about your situation, been doubtful, challenged you about what you're doing? What's been the reaction among the medical staff that you've worked with?
Initially, I was told that it was all nonsense and there's no real science behind any of it. More recently, it's been very different. The oncologist that I see now, and the reason I see him now is because initially the response was just so negative that it was disheartening and not helpful. I was just told that the prognosis was terrible and there was nothing I could do about it, and it wasn't worth looking at these things because could cause more harm than good. But then I found Mr. Kevin O'Neill, who's also a neurosurgeon at Charing Cross Hospital, and his whole interest is metabolic therapies and ketogenic diets. And then I got introduced to the research center at Imperial College London, who are focusing on ketogenic diets and brain tumors. And eventually I got involved with some of their research, and that piqued my interest into getting back to studying and getting involved with brain cancer research. And so, yeah, they're very positive about it now, especially at Charing Cross, where that's a big focus of what they do. And he's told me since I've been doing it that he's had so many patients come to him for surgery, and what they do is these patients often contact Tom Seyfried or other people in that realm, and the whole thing is with brain cancer is that if you go on a fast at least a week or a few days before surgery, it's actually easier to remove the tumor because it acts as a very effective anti-angiogenic therapy. So his the way that he describes it to me is that he's better able to actually operate on these patients because the tumors become more circumscribed. They're easier to it's easier to define the edges, so he can remove more of the tumor. And he's told this to me because often these patients have come to him after talking to me. So that's quite something to hear, and yeah, it's quite humbling in a way.
Yeah, that angiogenesis, and for the people who don't speak medical, I mean, that's just the formation of new blood vessels. And so these tumors are very good at making their own blood supply. And so if you can prevent that, then it's not such a bloody surgery. That's the one thing. When you're dealing with a highly vascular area, you're going to bleed and bleed and bleed, and then that bleeding contaminates everything. And so that's interesting to hear. And I'm not surprised by that. When you so you've got these folks that are following this and having better outcomes. We see, there's more research definitely being directed with ketogenic diets with regard to cognitive function, dementia. I mean, there's been, some done in tumors. Let me ask you, this is what I want to ask you. So I should have asked this at the beginning, but astrocytoma, you said it was grade 3, so highly anaplastic, which means very dedifferentiated, very, just weird, bizarre looking cells. What is a typical prognosis? I mean, if you hadn't done what you've done, what would the typical course be for somebody like you?
It can vary quite widely, but typically it's between 3 and 5 years for that type of tumor. But I say it can vary quite widely because what anaplastic astrocytoma is actually a broad class of different types of tumors. And if we think about it that way, if prognosis is like this, mine was more towards the poorer end of that. Let's say that average range of 3 to 5 years. So mine was in the poorer end because I didn't have the so-called beneficial mutations, and I had some deletions, some chromosomal deletions, which were suggestive of a poorer outcome. Also, I had a very high Ki index, and that's the proliferation index. So every patient can have access to their histopathology report, and one of the things it will tell you is the Ki index, and that's a good marker of trying to predict over the course of time what's likely to happen.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it's been years since I've done any oncology. I think the Ki index has to do with the amount of DNA material versus the rest of the cell. If I'm not mistaken, that indicates cell turnover. Is that correct? Or maybe I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, it's essentially counting how quickly the cells are dividing. Yeah.
Wow, that's from probably 30 years ago. That stuff, so still stuck in my brain somehow. Interesting. Let me ask you about, obviously, are you getting a lot of people? I mean, tell me about the people who are contacting you. I mean, you're obviously there's people that kind of out of desperation, probably, they've probably already been through the system, so to speak, got it diagnosed with the tumor, the brain tumor, and probably other types of tumors. Somebody's asked me, and if we can go back to, I'm blanking on the name now, I just stuck with my memory, but Otto Wahlberg, the Wahlberg effect, we've got that going with it, shows that, tumor cells preferentially take up glucose, or at least some of them do at a pretty high rate. I don't know what that rate is. Maybe you do. Thomas Seyfried talks about glutamate. Does that play a role in your tumor? And what, because I'm hearing that some tumors do better with ketones. I mean, they prefer ketones. And I think maybe somebody referred to things like melanoma, but I'm not sure. Do we have a better understanding of which tumors respond best to a ketogenic style diet, which ones may not? Is that pretty well delineated, or is that still speculative?
Yeah. So theoretically, you can, because it's still theoretical, you can look at the genetic profile of the tumor and attempt to assess that. Or you can simply, if it's a lower grade tumor, it's more likely to be highly glycolytic. So it would make sense to have that kind of approach. Whereas with these higher grade tumors, and if you go even higher than mine, if you go to some types of glioblastoma, they'll use anything for fuel: nucleic acids, certain amino acids, fatty acids, and the glucose and the glutamine. So it's a difficult landscape to try and traverse and to understand, but there are certain markers you can look at. For example, you can also look at, say, the BRAF mutation, the BRAF, and that can indicate that you might benefit from a copper depletion approach. And that may be a diet that's lower in copper, and then you have these copper depletion therapies on top of that. So there is this nutrient deprivation approach, but with any kind of approach, say if you're using a glutamine inhibitor, you don't want to do that for a long time. It's kind of one of these, I know Thomas Seyfried likes to have this press pulse approach, and I've adopted some of those methods. But the press in that case would be that you have this glutamine inhibitor, and I think he uses DON, but there are others, that you can use for a period of time where you're restricting all these other things, and then maybe adding hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which I had quite successfully in my case. And so you could do that and then pull back and have more of a pulse therapy after that.
Do you feel if you abandon your current strategy and went back to this sort of a normal diet, the normal junk food diet that everybody think is normal, would you think the tumors would come back and the seizures would come back pretty quickly? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would theoreticize that would be the case, but I wouldn't really like to experiment that with that, primarily due to the fact that my seizures would get a lot worse, and the epilepsy in itself could kill me. So it's quite a serious thing. If I was told that I never had, it would absolutely never come back, then I would still be as equally concerned, because the epilepsy in my case was extremely serious.
Did you, and I don't know how frequently you were having seizures. I'm sure you can comment on that, but were there restrictions on your ability, like drive and things like that at some point in medications? And you're completely off all meds and you can drive and stuff like that now without concern. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. But at that time where I was having grand mal seizures constantly throughout the day, I wasn't even able to get out of bed. So I wasn't really thinking about driving, but I wasn't able to do that either. And then it got to the point where I was able to do some exercise by my bed, just having a step, and that helped my epilepsy to a point. But then I was still having semi-serious seizures, and then it led to the point where I discovered the magnesium, and that very effectively gave me that extra step when I was gradually withdrawing my medication to mitigate against those withdrawal seizures that everyone gets if you're gradually coming off medication for epilepsy. So I had that in combination with the frankincense essential oil that has the Boswellic acids. So I had that as a combination under the tongue with the magnesium. And then I was effectively able to, over time, get off all the medication and have more freedom. So yeah, I could drive if I wanted to and do all these crazy things, risky things. and I can get COVID and not die. Because
yeah, what just one of your fellow UK people had a question in here about why do you think either your cancer appeared or cancers in general? Can you, I know that's a loaded question, and there's probably a million people that would like to have their own perspectives on that, but what are your thoughts on why we get cancers, or why did you get cancer perhaps?
Well, I can only really speak for brain tumors, and I've investigated this quite extensively over the years, actually. And I've pinned it down to a number of very strong correlations. So the brain injury paper interested me in terms of my case, but then I'm going to plug my podcast here, but I did an episode of my podcast where I investigated brain cancer clusters, and I found that there was this very strong association with certain chemicals. So one such chemical which has a very strong correlation with glioblastoma in particular is vinyl chloride, and it's the vapor. So if people start freaking out and saying, vinyl chloride is in so many things, then it's not necessarily a concern unless you're inhaling it somehow. So I'd say maybe be very careful when you're at the gas station or doing DIY and this kind of thing. So that's the biggest thing that I've seen, this exposure to certain chemicals.
So because you mentioned a couple times you got COVID. What was the story on that? I mean, how'd you find out? I mean, was it a problem? Do you feel that the regimen you're on mitigated that a little bit? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was a bit run down, and I was doing a lot of flying last year. And I thought I'd gotten away with it because I had so many flights last year, and it wasn't really the best time for flying. And the UK at that time wasn't actually having people have tests before they go on flights. So I think I may have got it from either the flight or the airport. And this was early January. So I had a positive test on the 5th, and I experienced headaches behind my eyes, partial seizures that were only affecting part of my brain, but giving me very strange symptoms, sensations. And I had a bit of a fever for a few days, but then I was fine after.
Let me ask you, just back to the entomophagy, the bug eating. What percentage of your diet does that consist of? I mean, if you had to say my diet is 10% bugs or 20%, where would you put that at?
It depends on availability. So at the moment, I'm just getting back into it with the insect farm because I didn't have an insect farm for a long time, and I was just having organ meats and other fatty meats. But now it's only a very small amount. But at the time, in the past it was around 30%.
So
it's quite hard to get more than that.
in the UK, and in the sort of under the guise of preventing climate change, there's been some talk about taxing of meats. That I saw that the Parliament sort of gave the thumbs down on that, but that's continuing to be an issue. Are you concerned? I mean, how would that impact you personally as a person if you couldn't afford or had a limited access to things like meat? How would that impact your life?
I'd definitely be consuming more insects, and I'm thankful that I can tolerate. I'm thankful that I can tolerate a lot of insects without any gastrointestinal issues or any other symptoms. It's different to plant fiber. I find that animal fiber I'm okay with. But the whole thing about climate change and these big organizations wanting us to eat bugs is that they don't want us to cultivate our own bugs. They don't want us to breed our own bugs. They want to give us these very poor quality GMO fed, just substandard kibble bugs.
So we got factory farm bugs,
or lab grown bugs, maybe, but with lab grown ingredients to feed them.
Yeah, I've seen some people actually talk about actually growing bugs to then later feed to animals, and that may be a sensible thing, because that would sort of potentially offset some of the concerns about feeding animals grains, and you could feed them bugs instead, which they happily eat. I'm told anyway. At least some of them do, particularly things like pigs and chickens. So they love bugs.
Yeah. So my main reason for having that is because I don't have space for a proper farm in my garden. So if I had space for a proper farm, I'd still have that, but I'd probably feed more of that to the animals, and use it for fishing, because waxworms are exceptional bait for fishing. They absolutely love it.
Yeah, Charlotte was asking about any other supplement. You talked about the Boswellia, but do you take some vitamin C, glutathione, or any other supplements, NAD, or any of those things in addition to that? What does your supplement routine look like, and do you find them to be particularly efficacious?
Well, when I had a visible disease still on my scans, I was taking a glucose inhibitor, and that was the active ingredient is fluorescein. And I found that lowered my blood glucose quite substantially, but at some times to the point where it was almost too much. But I do believe that the glucose inhibitor played a role in helping me. And also certain drugs. I purposely put myself on an anti-epileptic drug called sodium valproate shortly after my surgery. And it's not an anti-epileptic drug that's often prescribed in my case, because it can cause quite unpleasant mental side effects. So it can cause suicidal thoughts, and in women, it can cause deformed babies if they decide to have kids and all this. But it has quite major benefits for brain cancer. One of which is it acts as an HDAC inhibitor, which the ketogenic diet does as well. Ketogenic diet has so many roles, not just if you're thinking about the fuels. It changes brain chemistry and favorably, and has all these other anti-inflammatory effects and all these other wonderful things. But the omega-3 and 6 ratio is a huge thing that I pay attention to as well. So in and around brain tumors, you see very high amounts of omega-6, and with the arachidonic acid pathway, you see how that plays in. And that's one way the Boswellic acids help, because that inhibits that formation of that inflammatory that inflammatory process, kind of like the same process when you have thrombosis. So it's inhibiting that, and then if you through diet try to have more of an optimal ratio of omega-3 and 6, then you're actually able to change what's happening in the brain.
Do you have a number in mind for that ratio? Phil's asking about that. Do you include fish to help you get there? Or what's your goal, target goal for your omega-3 to 6 ratio?
Well, I try and get as close to 1 as possible. It's not really possible, but I guess it's more achievable to aim for that, but then have like a 1 to 3, which will always likely be in favor of omega-6, because it would be very, very difficult to have a 1-to-1 ratio, but that's what I aim for.
But I guess daily, I imagine you probably stick to a relatively consistent routine. I mean, is there an eating schedule? Is there a fasting window? Are you a proponent of prolonged fasting? What does a day look like, or a week look like for you as far as diet, exercise, sleep, so on and so forth? What do you try to strive for?
Well, usually I wake up, I go for my 2-hour walk. After my walk, I'll have usually some type of seafood. At the moment, I've been eating a lot of oysters because they're high in zinc and I had COVID. And I eat twice a day. And I don't eat past, well, usually I try to not eat past sunset. So the sun's just set now, so I'm not going to eat. And I'll often go with just how I feel. Sometimes after my 2-hour walk, I won't feel hungry. So I'll just have a spontaneous fast and I won't eat until I feel ravenously hungry. And then I'll test my blood sugar and see what's happening with that. Because it's interesting to see if it's physiological hunger or if it's that you're actually hungry.
And just to clarify, when you say physiological hungry, I'm hungry, does that mean blood glucose is low, therefore I need to eat? Or can you better delineate that little dichotomy you mentioned there?
Yeah, well, I have years and years of food diaries with also food and mood and symptoms all in a nice table to look at. And I've noticed that when my blood sugar is in a certain range and I'm hungry, then that's when I'm really physiologically hungry. But then if I'm thinking I'm hungry, but then I look at my blood sugar and it's actually past my determined threshold that I've found over the years, then I'll not eat and I'll just continue the fast for a bit longer.
So is that something like 5.0, millimolar versus something lower? I don't know what your number is. You basically, if the blood sugar is too high, you're not going to eat. Basically, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot.
And that'll help my seizure control. But if I find that I feel like I need to eat because of my epilepsy and I'm not physiologically hungry, then I need to take in electrolytes rather than food. So I make up an electrolyte mix and I just drink it, and then I feel fine again, and my seizure threshold goes back up.
And I'm sure somebody wants to ask, what is that electrolyte mix? So is it sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium? What's in there?
Yeah, it's a mixture of magnesium sulfate, sodium chloride, potassium chloride, and sodium bicarb.
Okay.
And I have very specific amounts that I have.
I'm sure. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'll tell you what, Andrew, thank you for doing this. And I'm assuming no dairy. You're still no dairy free.
Well, I've recently changed because I can tolerate dairy from I can tolerate raw dairy from goat and sheep.
Okay.
But not cow.
Yeah, I guess I should probably delve into that a little more. You said you've been able to tolerate foods again that you once couldn't. What do those include? Obviously, you just talked about the dairy. Are there any other plant foods or things that you can now tolerate, fruits or anything like it? What can you tolerate that you couldn't before?
The main thing that I have no problems with is olives, mushrooms. Can have mushrooms, and sauerkraut. Interestingly, because sauerkraut used to give me headaches and doesn't give me headaches now. So maybe there have been changes in my gut. I don't know.
Have you tested your gut? I mean, and I know that's a tough one because we really don't know what the hell's going on with the gut. I think it's still there's just too much stuff going on to really get a good assessment. But have you done any of that and seen any changes?
I did once. It didn't really give me much insight. And it was a few years ago. So I have no idea. All of these tests are quite expensive. So I don't continuously test everything. I just go by how I feel. And if I don't have seizures, that's a win for me.
Have you been, I mean, I can't remember. Has anybody written you up as a case report or anything in the medical literature?
My oncologist always wants to do this and he always badgers me about it. But the amount of information he wants me to collect for him and to get all my notes together for him is just not. So it's an exhaustive effort. So I don't really, it doesn't excite me. I think I'd like him to have his secretary do it.
Sure. I got you. Yeah, I know it's a lot of work. It's a lot of pain doing medical research. I mean, regardless, you're getting the information out there. I mean, lots of people have heard your story, and I think I mean, some of these medical papers that get written up, they get read by 4 people. I mean, it's literally, you look at some of these things, and you spend a year or 2 working on it, and 6 people read it. So, I mean, just getting out there on social media.
I think what helped most is when I was in the New Scientist article.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the article, but I mean, certainly I became aware of you somehow several years ago, and I know other people have. And so keep doing what you're doing. Like I said, it makes me very happy to see that you're still around giving interviews. And so hopefully this will be the case for the next 50, 60, 70 years, however long you have left around. So that would be wonderful to be, and hopefully we'll know a heck of a lot more about this, as things go by. Andrew, is there anything you want to leave us with? Any places if people are interested maybe to find out some more stuff? I don't know if you're doing any writing or speaking or, concerned about that, but if so, let us know where we can find you.
Well, I'm writing an ebook on the gadolinium. I think that's a very important topic that's not often covered. I also have a podcast, the Human Guinea Pig Project, where I interview brain cancer survivors and experts in the field to look at different treatments, metabolic and otherwise. And I'm also on Twitter, Scarbs.
Well, wonderful. And again, it's a pleasure talking with you, and look forward to maybe doing this again in a couple more years when you're still around, obviously, and we know a little more.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, well, enjoy your evening and enjoy hopefully it'll start warming up there. And I don't know when it gets warm in the UK, but
I'll be out there anyway.
Anyway, good for you. All right. Okay, guys, we'll see everybody tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Take care and have a good rest of your week. Happy Valentine's Day, by the way, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.